Hello everyone, today we talk about the effigy of Sir Robert de Vere, 3rd Earl of Oxford, located in the Church of St. Mary, Hatfield Broad Oak, England. The effigy is dated back to the second half of the 13th century. We will try to be more precise later, but some date this sculpture, this grave plate, essentially back to the 60s of the 13th century, to be more precise. But it's partly just a conjecture based on certain hints that we will discuss later. But I think there is really no certainty. This is a very interesting effigy in many ways because it's a bit iconic of definitely of what a knight in the second half of the 13th century could look like. Let's say at just past the mid of the 13th century look like, and that's what we're gonna look like. I mean, observing its panoply and this the script in it, and trying to carve something out of it of interesting. And I think it's interesting also to contextualize who Robert de Vere actually was, his life. Interestingly enough, he was born seemingly after circa 1164 and 1165. He was the second surviving son of Aubrey de Vere, 1st Earl of Oxford. His older brother, also named Aubrey, was the second Earl of Oxford. He died in 1214, and that's when Robert essentially became the 3rd Earl of Oxford himself. His mother was Agnes of Essex, who was essentially also he was the daughter of the royal constable Henry of Essex. So these guys were faring rather well, and they were covering quite prestigious charges. We don't really know. We are in a period in history in which we don't really know a big much about these individuals. In fact, speaking of Robert, we don't really know much about him until his marriage with Isabel de Bolebec, the widow of Henry the Nonant of Totnes, Devon, who had died in 1206. So she married Robert the year afterwards, and it's essentially, in fact, in 1214 that Robert becomes Earl of Oxford, and also assuming to this title the estates and the hereditary office of Master Chamberlain of England. Quite of an office, telling the truth. And as we were saying before, Robert joined he was one of the barons that essentially, actually I remember where I said it. He was actually one of the 25 guarantors of the Magna Carta. Interestingly enough, and in fact he joined the disaffected barons who met at Stamford after the Battle of Bouvines, the massive military disaster of the Kingdom of England against France, forcing King John at that point, whose authority had definitely been resized, to issue the Magna Carta at Runnymede, or I don't know, excuse me for the pronunciation, I don't know, on June the 15th, 1215. So Robert was elected as one of the barons who were to guarantee the king's adherence to its terms, and together, because of this, together with other Magna Carta barons, he was also excommunicated as a rebel by Pope Innocent III on December the 16th, 1215, because this was essentially the moment in which, in order to save the throne, King John, who was actually a good king, I believe. I mean, he was a capable sovereign, a capable politician. His fame is quite unjustly shadowed by the one of Richard Lionheart, but really he actually played, considering he lived in a pretty dramatic moment of England. You can argue that the same defeat of Bouvines was a direct consequence, but leadership in some way, but war is also something you can't really decide exclusively on basing on your political capabilities. Things can go wrong. Also, if you're a quite capable ruler, and he was actually responding pretty well. And at that point, he basically proclaimed himself vassal of the Roman Church. So at that point, basically, Innocent III protected him and excommunicated these barons that were now pretty imposing on the royal authority. And at this point, actually had also offered the English crown nonetheless to Prince Louis of France. So these French connections at the time were definitely very, very important for English internal affairs, and in fact Robert even took up arms against King John, and although essentially pledging loyalty to him after that the king had taken Castle Hedingham in March 1216. So it was a bit of this political gaming of say, okay, well, I show, at least formally, given that there was the political practice in feudal Europe, to show an allegiance, essentially, this act of loyalty, of fealty that had to prove the commitment of these vassals to the royal cause. But eventually, the same in the year after, in 1217, the same Prince Louis of France, actually Louis of France would become the king, the French King Louis VIII, retook the castle Hedingham and restored it to Robert. But despite of this, in the same year, the Earl of Oxford transferred once again his allegiance to the new king that had been elected at that point, as John had died, and his 9-year-old son Henry III was now to succeed, essentially. So at that point, with the death of John, it was thought that it was not necessary to involve the French more than much into the English affairs. However, although Robert did homage to Henry III, he was not fully restored in his offices and lands until the early 1218. Eventually, Earl Robert served as a king's justice in 1220 and 1221, and he died shortly before October the 25th, 1221. So he was buried eventually at the Hatfield Regis Priory, where either his son Hugh de Vere, 4th Earl of Oxford, or his grandson Robert de Vere, 5th Earl of Oxford, had an effigy erected in which he is depicted in chainmail, cross-legged, pulling his sword from his scabbard and holding a shield, displaying his de Vere arms. And that's where we get to this grave plate that is definitely very, very interesting. So relatively to the dating, now it's relatively problematic because, first of all, we know that this statue was made after the death, several years actually after the death of Robert. So consistently later than 1221. And some authors, just like Nicole, suggested that basically, and not only him, I suspect, that the style of carving could indicate that the effigy is datable to the end of the 13th century. Although, looking at the arms and armor, actually, we think that this is at least representing a knight that could be, a panoply that could date back as far as the mid-13th century. So it's been speculated essentially that the sculptor of the effigy might have been aware that 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 his subject died several years earlier. So he basically attempted to portray an old-fashioned equipment to make it more realistic, more plausible. And it is, in fact, however, there are several elements that are worth of notice in this picture. Starting about the male, he's wearing definitely a hauberk, although he's wearing in his head a separate male coif, held tight by what it looks like either a strap or lace around the brow, although this could also be a decorative circlet indicating the knight's rank. Now, the circlet is essentially something consistent, not just a lace or a strap. It figures also in other equipment of the time. It was a sort of looking like a sort of crown in theory, symbolically as a symbol of power and of prestige. But at the same time, given even where it was worn, it could actually be also could function as a form of protection. Definitely, you have basically a circle of metal essentially protecting your forehead and so on. So the this if you receive a sword blow on your head, maybe it's better that if just in the padded cloth underneath the coif and the coif you have something more consistent to protect your skull. Considering, however, that these guys would wear in battle the helm, that it is omitted on the effigy, the helm, that at this point in the 13th century was to cover essentially the whole face. That the knight's helm had undergone a progressive evolution over time, for which now, and they had come to cover the whole face. So these guys would wear it over the male coif, and it was a pretty consistent, arguably the most effective piece of armor that they were wearing, given that it was thicker, etc. At this point, in the second half of the 13th century, I made some videos about it. That plate armor starts appearing in some form, and the only piece of plate armor, however, we get from the average mid-13th century knight is essentially the helm in itself. It's pretty thick, pretty heavy, but that's in order to protect the head that every fighter essentially has as a priority. I mean, protecting the head in any case is sometimes we find even in movies and so on this idea guys went out there with no headgear, with no head protection, but actually even the poorest peasant or whatever would wear some sort of cap or something, even just in leather, just hoping to absorb the hit, because you can be hit in so many parts of your body, but definitely the head is the one that, given the ratio hits damage, is definitely the most vulnerable and has to be protected better. The reason why there is no helm in here is essentially that Earl Robert's features could be seen. I mean, his face was recognizable. This is present in so many other funerary effigies, and it was a way naturally to. So at this point, it was more of an artistical thing, and naturally there was no reason. These effigies naturally show us the ideal of a very strongly militarized and chivalric society, for which naturally these guys were going to the outer world, let's say, wearing into afterlife, wearing full warrior armor. So this was who they were and what they were meant to be, essentially, even as guardians of Christian society in theory. So they were presenting themselves to God in this way, and however showing their faces. So essentially this was a claim to say, okay, this is what I've done, what I've been in my life, which also was naturally a burden, given that in Christian morals, definitely killing was a sin, but in part this was justified at the time, saying, if you are a defender of the Christian society, in theory, you can kill sinning, but doing it for a greater good. And the Christian thought was at that point justifying the use of violence, of just violence, for certain objectives, and not. Naturally, these knights were extremely involved, as we've seen, in very dirty business in many ways, that were to which they were essentially playing for their own profits, the one of their family, and so on. But this was still also a social matter of showing off. Looking at first of all, having an effigy like this made for you was definitely a very evident status symbol of a wealthy and powerful person. We have seen which offices he was covering in his life, and there were definitely many reasons for being depicted like this. The face was the way to be recognized as the person that he was, not just a knight, not just a fighter, but also Robert de Vere. Kind of banal, but it's still. Excuse me, I drink a little as usual. So the circlet also had this function. By the way, consider that knights at this time wouldn't always wear the helm. I mean, the helm was really worn just in those moments before the cavalry charge, or during combat, of course, also, but preferably really in the moments before the combat that really lasted actually a very few minutes every time, because the helm at this point was definitely enveloping, was an all-enveloping armor around the face. There were just eye slits and certain other holes to make air pass in order to breathe, but it was very hard to be in them. It definitely definitely decreased your sight, even your hearing. Reason for which figures like squires were vital at this point, but because they would be the eyes and the ears of their masters, kind of shouting at them from the rear, look right, look left, something like that, in order to make him cope with the threats on the battlefield. But yeah, the same helm was actually worn not even when these guys mounted on horseback, or nor when they were advancing. I mean, literally in the last 100 meters. This is before when the charge basically started, because definitely breathing inside of them was kind of exhausting in many ways. We have extensive evidence of this from medieval sources, of knights that were really out of breath, they were exhausted in many ways. You can imagine the adrenaline, the other shocks, traumas, and so on. But even being in having your head inside of this iron cage, essentially, and with a padded cloth, the mail and so on, it was pretty tough. Think about it under the sun in summer, or even in the colder season, was nothing very pleasant. Reason for which it was worn just before, and therefore there could be even moments in which these knights would kind of want to take it off. Essentially, the helm, naturally protected, was very useful and in protecting the face and so on. But if you think about it, for centuries, knights had just a a nose guard, and the face was uncovered. So it's not that war was less violent in the 13th century. I mean, back, I don't know, in the 11th century than in the 13th. And I suspect, in fact, that most of the helms were worn because of the cavalry impact. You know, even if you look at the eye slits, how they narrowed down, and how the problem was now covering the face during the moment of the charge, because that's where your enemy would point at with the lance, hoping to strike it in through your skull, essentially. So that's how they would. There were horrendous and very often deadly wounds caused by lances penetrating even the eye slits. It could happen, but was rare. But the concept is that, you know, when you get exhausted, eventually you can't even take the helm off in some way. In fact, if you look at the chain of arms that is developed, especially at the end, I think in the first 14th century, you realize that these great helms that had, by the way, gone happening, were slung on their back and held by this chain of arms that was pinned to the breastplate. At that point, was created because the helm could be taken on and off, especially during these repeated charges that happened. So in the moment of the impact, you would wear the helm, but as soon as possible, you would take it out, because it would be exhausting to keep it on. So even certain combat, especially when you get very heated and you need to breathe a lot, you know, could actually happen even without the helm, possibly. And this probably was not really prescribed, because obviously it's very preferable. You want to cover your face with a solid iron guard like the one the helm provides, but it's still possible that part of these knights fought with the helm on. There was probably some kind of bravadery in also fighting without. After all, we have many iconographical sources that show us that the mail coif or the hauberk, also covering the two things were separated, but originally there were also hauberks, covering your head, from your head to your legs, essentially, so in one piece. But the idea is that the face, and even in certain combat situations, the face was uncovered. There were many other fighters that also were fighting in kind of that fashion, so it might not be so exclusively. This idea that you don't see the helm here is not really something exclusively related to the need of showing the face, because otherwise they might have put, I don't know, the helm at their feet, or still represented it in some other way, which happened, I think, in some case, or maybe, this posed some problem. However, yes, iconically, these guys would wear their helm, but even being without is something you could see, even in battle, in certain circumstances, between a charge and another. Really nothing so artistically dictated by the need now showing the face, which in a funerary monument is definitely important, even for, say, affection reasons. Showing that what this person looked like, given that there weren't photographs at the time that people put in their graves. Essentially, today, at the time, wasn't like that. So this was also a way, naturally, to remember the person. Looking at the rest of the hauberk, there is another indicator that might help to date the armor to kind of earlier than the usual. That is the mittens, rather than individual fingers. That over time, basically, the hauberk, initially you just had, I think the hauberk was had just this very primitive way, having your whole hand covered by a unique piece of mail, just maybe a part of it Oh my god, sorry, I'm here messing up one thing. Having just the space, the protuberance, the bulge to insert the thumb. So really, that's all you mostly needed, because you, especially with a one-hand sword, you would keep, your the grip basically entails you have the other four fingers all around the handle, and just moving, playing a little bit with the thumb, mostly on the sword, to direct it better towards certain direction. So initially, this wasn't. This was normally the mitten, what the mitten, the male mitten was like. Then eventually, the space for the protuberance for the separated fingers to be inserted in the mitten was created, and we don't see it in here, in fact. Very interesting are also the leg, is the leg protection. Essentially, here you have some male chausses. The male chausses is essentially our armor for legs, that could extend to the knee or cover even the entire leg. So they were like stockings substantially, and this naturally was aimed at offering a flexible protection that was effective against mostly slashing weapons. At that point, how male in general general is, you can find shows since the male shows since the time of the since even in the Bayeux tapestry, actually, as the same William the Conqueror and several other Normans are wearing them. And eventually, the shows had become more common during the 12th century, and virtually all knights by the 13th were wearing them. So they could be made in different ways. Here the shows are, I think, are padded. There is a padding cloth underneath them, as basically every part of mail had this padding cloth underneath it. But here you see on the shows that it has it basically even visible underneath. And so beneath, oh no, sorry, I was saying, sorry, another thing, that the what is padded actually is the cuisse, that now we will pass to it. The shows in here is basically what you see from the elbow, from the knee down. The padded cuisse is instead what you see over. So I think also you can see it naturally, but these shows were worn surely over some padding as well. I mean, I don't think that there was actually the naked leg behind the shows in here. So there were also certain sort of socks and stocks and some that were worn. And what you can see here is instead the padded cuisse. Now, cuisse in French, this is an old French vocabulary, because at the time, the French knights were on the lead in the development of armor, still in many ways, and the military vocabulary was largely French. The cuisse is instead this other armor that you can see, worn to protect the thigh. In fact, cuisse meaning thigh, and this eventually they evolved. I mean, the cuisse evolves like many other parts of the armor, from mail to plate. Here you see naturally mail still, and and this is padded, in fact. So it covered basically the the legs, it doesn't seem there to have been, at least I can't see it from the picture. I mean, it seems like the chausses, that is the leg, let's divide between leg armor and thigh armor, basically seem to stop up to the knee, if I see well, or at least we can see from, let me see another picture of this, whether this armor was, yes, it does seem that, at least from the statue, that the the shows stop upwards with the Poleyns, so the essentially the knee guards, and then basically the thigh, the leg armor stops and the thigh armor starts. So it's as if basically now the thigh armor here was probably tied to the belt in some form, to the waist in some form. So basically the chausses and the cuisses were separated. Was no continuity, and probably no other armor worn behind underneath the padded chausses. So what is interesting, in fact, in here are the Poleyns. So these knee caps or knee guards, also called genouillères. So that would be a French term to define the knee guards, that are quite interesting because they are attached to the vertically quilted cuisse, interestingly enough. And these Poleyns are still relatively simple. You know, they don't look domed, sorry, and not doomed, but appear to be simple plates of iron, or either hardened leather fastened directly to the cuisse. This is interesting because, first of all, there is one problem from these effigies, also from other iconographic sources, that we don't know essentially of what material this first plate armor was practically made of. There is no way to tell, really. The plate armor in this sense starts appearing as something probably initially made in simpler material. Actually, the hardened leather, or cuir bouillie as it was called in French, was appearing as, you know, it was extensively used, probably much more used than we imagine, also for the same horses, sometimes, as you know, it was relatively, it was naturally much cheaper than the male armor, and in this sense was still, however, pretty effective in many ways. Even the same gambeson was used as padded coat, was pretty much useful against many blows that arrived. It might seem strange, but this absorbed pretty much. In fact, some of these padded coats were even worn over the armor in many ways to absorb the blow in the first place. Naturally, there was always a balance between, you know, being overloaded and also, you know, hampered in movements than you know, the sake of for the sake of protection and the in fact mobility. You know, the problem is essentially that at the end of the day you can be overloaded in armor but still not able to fight because of that. So this is pretty normal. And these Poleyns seem to be attached, in fact, to the cuisse, directly fastened. From the picture, I don't think it's so evident, or it can be really said. They might have also been attached partly to the chausses, but I don't know. They might have also been actually fastened individually. I don't really know how this could have been built practically, but nevertheless it's interesting because it's one of the it's one of the first examples of the Poleyns in medieval armor. This is important because the Poleyns seems to have appeared into the medieval in the knight's panoply around 1225. And these in fact originally were nothing but a sort of kind of a disc-shaped piece of iron, often attached to the cuisse, but otherwise also fastened directly to the main chausses. So actually what you see in this effigy might actually represent the Poleyn as a sort of juncture, as a sort of joint between the chausses and the cuisse. Then eventually the Poleyn would evolve into something more consistent, also more domed shaped to deflect the blows in iron or steel, but it's possible that these were the ones represented here were still in well, I don't know. You can see here, if you look at the picture, it's possible that the plate was made of iron or steel, and actually, you know, the difference is pretty tricky because also by definition, because I think most of these pieces were actually at this point, every armor piece was actually in steel. Although this, you know, essentially steel is just a iron with a certain percentage of carbon. So there's not a huge difference. But in effectiveness, and it also depends really on many other factors. There were sometimes even bronze Poleyns, as well as shoulder guards and something like that. That bronze is also pretty much resistant, and was still used even at this time for armor. Sometimes bronze can even be better than iron, depending on, you know, certain factors that now we can't explain. But if you look at the picture, it looks as if, you know, there is this black of the Poleyn, and then underneath this, you see this, it looks a bit flexible actually. If you look especially at the right leg, there is this support over which the plate is attached that could be something flexible, something in leather probably, some other organic material that therefore made the joint more flexible, but at the same time held in front of the knee this plate. This was very important. It actually shows a pretty dynamic need for also, you know, protecting these joints. Now think about what cavalry combat could be like, you know, even falling from horse and needing to fight on the back. You know, knee guards are used still by soldiers because obviously they have to jump around to get on their knees to get down. So it's pretty normal. Here in the statue, if I'm not wrong, in fact we don't see the elbow guards, but it's possible, you know, that the average knight at this point might have worn them, definitely, as well for the same reason. Naturally, there was a preference for the leg for many reasons, because naturally the legs have to absorb more strength, and that's also generally they're kind of even more exposed, because the shield, and now we'll talk about the shield was getting smaller at this point, and in fact you see that it wasn't really arriving up to the, not even, I mean, if you look, it doesn't get even down to the, gets down only to the thigh basically. So, and it's relatively small, so definitely, especially if you're wearing a shield, maybe you don't have, especially on your left arm, you don't need an extra protection, because for the arm. But you know, this is also naturally a bit theoretical, because the shield can be destroyed during combat as well. So maybe you need that. But here, in fact, you see that the guy is wearing knee guards, but not elbow guards, which might suggest it was naturally less reason to defend the elbow at that point. Also because in the right hand, with the right arm, you have your sword, so it's kind of even difficult to hit you at that point over your elbow so directly. It could definitely happen. Everything can happen, but still. And I think in this sense, armor protection for knees is mostly thought to absorb hits that can arrive when you are actually on horseback. Not even the need of protecting your knees in case you have to kneel for some reason to get down, but mostly because of this need of protecting the leg. Given that this, towards the 13th century, essentially the mounted elite was increasingly mounted. This is kind of a weird thing to say, but this is the idea, is that heavy cavalry was getting increasingly more specialized as heavy cavalry, so the chances of even of fighting on foot were relatively decreasing. I'm saying relatively because at this time knights were fighting on foot as well, and pretty much and pretty intensely. But the problem is that they used to stay more on horseback, especially when all around were starting to be dangerous things like crossbows. When you're on horseback, you're definitely very exposed, but also especially pole arms, like infantry armed with weapons that can hit in fact you're on horseback, the easiest thing to hit is your legs. So in fact, if you see how the Western armor progresses over time at this point, is that the shield gets increasingly smaller and the plate armor develops, especially covering pretty much especially the legs. Essentially what you find as the chausses now were increasingly being replaced by actually plate armor, by plate footwear, something like that appears quite clearly in other contexts, where instead, if you had considered that plate costed a lot, so if you see it appearing somewhere, that's a pretty good indicator that was an area where you were expecting to be wounded consistently. So until you had the shield substantially, you could save theoretically some plate for your upper part, to distribute it on your lower part. You couldn't really defend. But eventually, as we know, also plate armor started developing primarily from the chest. That was naturally kind of exposed, and the shield was getting smaller, also because the shield now was even paradoxically less effective than the same plate armor. In fact, at the end of the Middle Ages, you see that the shields practically disappear, while guys were fully armored and usually using, blunt weapons to go after other knights in full armor to smash them at close range, and there was no need to use a shield anymore. Here the shield was already restricting. I mean, from the 11th and the 12th century, you had this progressive narrowing of the shield, and especially if you look at the Norman shield, for instance, the the kite shield, that was excellently covering also great part of your legs on the side when you were on horseback, and also on foot, because that could be used also in a shield war or something. You see it, for instance, in the Bayeux Tapestry, even into the Anglo-Saxon infantry. So the idea is now that the shield is kind of decreasing inside, while this first thing that gets uncovered is the legs, and therefore in parallel, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly at all, you find plate armor being developed also for the legs. So it kind of makes sense, and it's difficult to say this is the cause or the consequence. I mean, they were a bit same thing, and all because there were more. Usually, this is the given explanation. There were more deadly weapons around, primarily crossbows and pole arms, and so on. against which these knights were increasingly, fighting and dealing with. So, what else can we say about the armor or this other stuff? So, well, as we've seen, the shield is kind of flat topped, almost triangular at this point, and is held by certain enarm, other French term that basically designates those leather gripping straps attached to the back of the shields throughout. So the ones you would basically, that was the first grip. Then there was definitely a guige as well. Now the guige was also instead this long strap, also typically made of leather, that was used to hang a shield on the shoulder or the neck when not in use. And not just in that situation, because you could basically use it, both the enarm and the guige at the same time. So basically the guige could be loose enough to, especially this happened probably on horseback during the charges, that you may want to keep the shield fastened both by the guige and the enarm. And in fact, what you see in here in the Effigy of Robert is exactly this. I mean, the shield is the guige is hang over the knight's right shoulder, and the knight is still has the shield fastened with the enarm. In fact, what you see in here is that something even beyond that, it is basically the knight is not actually keeping the shield with his hand. He's not doesn't have an end grip. The shield is literally fastened to the left arm, and with the left hand he's actually holding the scabbard while he's pulling the sword out with his right hand. So this guy had basically a shield being tied to his arm and fastened even by the guige. Now, why is this the case? Well, the case is that these shields were gaining. This was mostly the indicator, in my opinion, of cavalry combat. Here, the shield is not something used in an extremely dynamic fashion. It's essentially an extra protection to the side in which basically you're not armed. That is the left one, when on the right you have the sword. So you are basically still you're not even making a lot of movement with your left arm. It's as if in order to defend yourself you would rotate your wall, your left side forward, and you would have the shield essentially protecting you by the foe. This might indicate naturally, if you look at the height of the shield at this point is right at the same level of the chin. So this naturally is means that probably, well, now we don't know, it's just a statue, but it's possible that with a movement of the shield you could basically cover even part of your face until probably the level of your eyes, so that you could still see. Naturally, as we've said, knights would fight also with the helm on, so this problem was kind of solved in that sense. But even if this guy had not worn the helm, probably he might have partly covered his face with a shield, in part with a guard. So an increasingly less dynamic use of the shield, if you want, at least in this case, because armor is getting heavier. However, it's not always the case. I mean, shields at this point could be used very dynamically as well, with other forms of of grip, and in fact there's plenty of evidence of this, even of of an arm actually handled with your hand, not just tied to your arm. But nevertheless, it's very meaningful also to see this other form of shield hanging, I don't know to call it, that can reveal this kind of details about their fencing techniques. What else can we say? Okay, we have talked about the circlet. We can talk about definitely the scabbard in itself, which is interesting because the scabbard here is supported by a pretty sophisticated series of straps. You see that which form even an integral part of the buckled sword belt. And in fact, this effigy is one of the clearest carvings of such a system, and it's very interesting in many ways. Unfortunately, the scabbard, as you see, is broken. If you look at the statue, it is almost seems like a dagger because there is simply a missing part of the bottom of the tip of the sword, the scabbard that is. I think it went lost. I don't think of other considerations in this moment. If anything, naturally, this shows the typical equipment of a 13th century knight in many ways, and there are certain elements that we've seen that are suggesting the spread of the beginnings of the spread of plate armor. This is really, I repeat, this is one of the first evidence we have about Poleyns being developed, and it's still in this rather primitive form, which was nevertheless pretty effective given probably the environment in which these guys were fighting. You see definitely a characterization, especially how the shield is used. Naturally, it speaks much, according to me, for mounted combat. Pretty much, because that was more functional. You can't. The idea is that if you have to handle the bridles, you can't think of how you use your shield. So you necessarily have to fasten it to your arms, and essentially hoping that your passive defense with your shield is gonna work by fastening it up to your left side and just letting the blows hit you. In a dismounted fight, probably here the straps were used in a more dynamic forms. Although, the shield was used in a more dynamic form that you can see also in other effigies that we will comment at one point. But this is also interesting because if you look at the enarm, you realize that they seem to fit essentially for the wall arm. I mean, they're not seemingly meant to fit now for being held with their hands, with your hands. So this means that either there were shields with different types of enarms. Now I'm just speculating. I really don't know. So certain shields that were to be worn just for being strapped to your shoulder, to your arm, or others that were instead used to be gripped and therefore to be used more dynamically into a fight. Point is though that the probably, well, it's complicated to speculate on these topics. Nevertheless, the idea is that especially the cavalry shield at this point was conceived, even if you think of where we're coming from. I mean, a shield that was remarkably longer and also heavier. It seems like it was a relatively passively used shield in some way. I mean, more functional are for shield walls, both on foot and even on horseback in some way. So the dynamism of the shield is probably something relative at this point, and it probably evolves the more even the smaller the shield is. But this is just my speculation, and just I was thinking about that other video I made. Now that I think about English history, the one of the Knight of Malvern Abbey. That is a similar type of video I made now, commenting on a grave blade, and the title is 13th Century Hammer and Buckler, the Effigy of Malvern Abbey. Well, that is very interesting, because instead it shows a knight that is actually very similar to in his equipment to the one of Robert de Vere, that is instead equipped with a buckler, and in a hammer. Now we think he might have been a sort of professional judicial champion, actually, and these figures did exist back in the day, and you see in there that the buckler is definitely conceived as for a much higher dynamic use than instead what this triangular shield, it doesn't matter how much it had already narrowed down compared to the longer kite-shaped shield, could really be used. So this is generally my consideration, and nevertheless, at this point the dynamism is not an option, in the sense that these guys, as we've often said, were actually trained to fight in every possible imaginable situation. However, they had been oriented now from some time also for a kind of combat that was pretty much collective. It was a formation combat, and especially on horseback, that was probably the most important part of the fight. By the way, what else can we say about this? Yeah, it seems like this shield would be perfectly well to just essentially protect your torso in a cavalry charge by just rotating your shoulder, your left shoulder in front of you, and absorbing the impact, even at an eye level, covering your face up to an eye level, and using. Naturally, you don't see the lances are basically non-existent in this kind of grave plates, except actually for, and I made a video about this, I think the I made a video, West Highlanders Weapons and Armor, 14th to 16th century, which those are some of a actually pretty good evidence of troops from grave plates, that's instead from the West Highlands, of warriors using being depicted with spears actually on their grave plates. That is not so frequent, and actually that if you listen to that video, you realize how they were characterized as fighters. But that is kind of an exception now. That's part of the Celtic fringe, let's say. Now, Robert de Vere kind of represents, in many ways, kind of a broadly it's the picture of a pretty homogeneous, pretty common European knight, let's say. There are certain characters that now I don't remember were typically English, actually, of this thing, that I can't clearly this is the idea that I had read. I don't know how true this is, but seemingly the English cuisses were typically entirely encapsulating, seemingly differently from the other continental knights, because of a greater prevalence of foot combat, seemingly. So in which the knight was put in condition also being more directly hit, I mean more surgically hit in certain parts of the body from mounted combat. That was kind of, but I think it's a kind of speculation. Now I find it written in here, but I don't really know how much this is true, not even if it's referring to a later period. But I don't really know. There is this prejudice. I don't know, English knights prefer to fight more on foot than others, but I'm not really sure, especially at this point, this time. I mean, you have to think that the knight was, doing essentially the same thing everywhere in Europe at this point. This idea that this Anglo-Saxon tradition of fighting on foot is, to me, overly emphasized, and it's actually a myth. I mean, this is true certainly for, if you look at the English military organization as a whole, a bit in terms of certain traditional organization and participation to the military service, but an English knight at this point was completely, and I mean completely, identical to any other knight in Europe. There is no difference between a French knight and an English knight at this point. I should check more in detail whether this thing of the quiz is true. Also, this idea is being reinforced because traditionally, there is this idea that until the Norman conquest, English armies were more foot armies substantially than what was happening than the continental ones, because of the development of Frankish cavalry in Europe, and this relatively more original organization that existed into the Anglo-Saxon world, but that has been overly emphasized. In my opinion, it is at all not true that the Anglo-Saxons didn't fight on horseback. Not even before the Norman conquest. There was probably a tendency not to have that. Britain was not very good for horse breeding, definitely, and there was a kind of maybe a sort of Germanic tradition that emphasized the participation of freemen. Therefore, also this idea that everybody could and had to participate, not with that social segmentation that you can find instead in the Carolingian world, that had progressively kind of ostracized other, the majority of the people from military service in some part, because the feudal lords didn't want to have armed subjects in many ways. So the let's say cavalry had become more dominating, but I think that there are many hints that show us that actually, at least the Anglo-Saxon elite was perfectly capable of fighting also on horseback. And that thing that Giraldus Cambrensis says that, traditionally the Anglo-Saxons didn't fight on horseback, it's really like a cliche and nothing else. Of course, then the Anglo-Saxons didn't have the same cavalry that the Normans had. That's pretty evident, but that because it was a particularly social system, a different social system, but still, mounted fighters have always been there at all times in Europe. So it's not that there are so many technical differences in how you would have to fight on horseback if your society is feudal or non-feudal. Still mounted combat, essentially doing the same thing. And even the prejudice that 14th century armies fought largely on foot, because, hey, think about Crécy, think about Poitiers, Azincourt, all the main battles where the English fought, with this massive amount of, especially of long movement, but also this mounted men at arms, suggested that, there had to be a sort of structural reason for which this this English nobility was more used to fight on foot than the other. This is, according to me, a pretty historically inaccurate modern obsession for categorization. If you look even at those battles, actually, you look at men at arms and how they lived and how they were trained. They were also in there completely identical to French knights. There were so many French knights that were dismounted as well sometimes. So there is, I think, no historical evidence whatsoever to claim that these knights were, in that particular case, they were fighting on foot as Englishmen because the situation required it, because they were, for instance, outnumbered and in defense. So at that point, you're gonna hope your best in defense. In defense, you have to stay on foot. It increases dramatically your defensive skills. Cavalry cannot defend by definition. Either you dismount, either you're done. Either you counterattack, either it's better you fight on foot otherwise. So that's, I think, the main reason. But still, there is this somewhat this stereotype that these guys were, the Englishmen fought mostly. The English noblemen were more used to fight on foot. I don't believe so. I believe it's virtually insignificant as a statement. And even if this thing of the quiz was true, but I'll have to ask someone who is more competent than this. I think it's just a very secondary aspect, a virtually influent aspect. And what you have to look is not the difference, but the essence. Modern people are obsessed by details. But you have to learn to look at the essence. And if you look at the essence, you look at the Effigy of Robert de Vere, this is a typical 13th century knight. And there's virtually nothing that you can say this in the essentials differed from any other European knight at this time. And in fact, we use such an effigy to actually state, oh, this is, say, the prototype of a European knight by, essentially, want to say the 60s of the 13th century. Yes. Okay, so I think, sorry when I make these technical descriptions, sometimes I, mumble and, can't speak straight, but I'm also just reflecting. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.